Before the name Deathstroke struck fear into the hearts of heroes and villains alike, there was simply a man, Slade Joseph Wilson, a soldier, a patriot, a husband and father, and, ultimately, a weapon forged in shadows. Slade's story begins in the quiet suburbs of Blue Valley, Nebraska, where discipline was instilled in him from a young age. Gifted with intelligence, determination, and a relentless willpower, Slade seemed destined for greatness. He was not content with ordinary life, nor did he fit into the mold of mediocrity. From the moment he could stand, Slade was drawn to the art of combat. His father, a strict and often abusive figure, hardened him into believing that strength was the only true measure of a man. Yet within him also grew a sense of independence, a defiance that would one day clash with the very institutions he served. At 16, Slade lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army. It was there, in the chaos of Vietnam, that his abilities first caught the attention of superiors. His instincts were sharper than most, his capacity for strategy bordering on brilliance. To Slade, war was not chaos, it was order, a grand puzzle, one in which he excelled at finding the winning solution. He advanced through the ranks, mastering every weapon placed in his hands, every tactic laid before him. But raw skill was not enough. Slade sought something greater, perfection. That opportunity came when he was recruited into a secret government program, a black ops experiment designed to create the ultimate soldier. Volunteers were scarce, the risks were enormous, but Slade accepted without hesitation. He was injected with a serum meant to push human potential beyond its limits. Most men would have died. Slade survived, and in surviving, he became something more. The transformation was staggering. His strength multiplied, his reflexes became inhuman, and his mind processed information at speeds that bordered on precognition. He could anticipate an enemy's move before they made it, calculate trajectories in the blink of an eye, and endure injuries that would kill another man. But perfection came with a cost. The serum altered not only his body, but also his mind. His temper grew darker, his judgment more ruthless. Where once there was a soldier loyal to his flag, now stood a warrior, bound only to his own code. It was during this time that Slade Wilson began to wear the mask of Deathstroke, the Terminator. The name was no accident. It symbolized finality, inevitability. To his enemies, Deathstroke was the shadow they could not outrun. To his employers, he was the ultimate mercenary, a weapon for hire with no equal. Nations could fall, regimes could collapse, all with the single pull of his trigger. But behind the mask was still a man, one torn between two worlds. On one side was his family, his wife Adeline Kane, herself a soldier, and his children. On the other, the battlefield, the blood-soaked life of a mercenary. For a time, Slade believed he could balance both, that the soldier and the father could coexist, but that illusion was shattered in the most brutal of ways. A mission gone wrong revealed his secret life to Adeline. The betrayal cut deep, and in a fit of rage, she shot him, aiming for the head. Miraculously, Slade survived, though the bullet claimed his right eye. From that day forward, the mask of Deathstroke became more than armor. It was a symbol of the life he could never escape. The world now knew Deathstroke not just as a mercenary, but as a legend. His reputation spread like wildfire. Heroes feared him, villains respected him, and governments whispered his name with both awe and terror. But this was only the beginning. For Slade Wilson's journey was not merely one of blood and steel. It was a tale of betrayal, tragedy, and an unyielding hunger for control. A man who sought to master his own destiny, even as the shadows of his choices consumed everything he loved. In the shadows of war, a legend was born, and his name was Deathstroke. Slade Wilson's transformation into the world's most feared mercenary did not come overnight. The path that forged Deathstroke was written in blood, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of perfection. When the experimental serum coursed through his veins, it unlocked far more than the military scientists had anticipated. His body became faster, stronger, more resilient. His reflexes reached superhuman levels, his mind capable of strategy and foresight beyond the limits of any soldier. Slade had become the embodiment of the perfect weapon. But this gift was also a curse, one that would corrode his humanity piece by piece, until all that remained was the cold, calculating predator the world would come to fear. The military could not control him. His transformation turned him into something unpredictable, something beyond their grasp. Slade walked away from the uniform and the flag, forging his own path in the shadows. His reputation as a mercenary grew with each mission, silent, precise, unstoppable. He was not bound by politics, not shackled by loyalty to nations or ideologies. His allegiance was to efficiency, to the art of war itself, and to the highest bidder who could afford his deadly talents. In this new life, he was no longer Slade Wilson the soldier. He was Deathstroke. Yet, behind the mask, the story was far more complex than a man who sold his sword for coin. Slade carried a family: Adeline, his wife, and their 2 children, Grant and Joey. For a time, he sought to balance the dual lives of mercenary and husband, assassin and father. But the very blood that empowered him was also the poison that tore his family apart. His secrecy, his violence, his hunger for conflict, these shadows followed him home. And soon, his house was no sanctuary. Adeline, once proud of his service, grew wary of the man her husband had become. The serum had amplified not just his strength, but his aggression, his paranoia, his need for control. The rift widened, and fate dealt its cruelest hand when his enemies struck where he was most vulnerable. His children. Grant, Slade's eldest son, was lured into becoming a weapon himself, taking on the mantle of Ravager in a misguided attempt to prove his worth to his father. But the experiment failed, and Grant paid the price with his life. Slade would never forgive himself. In his heart, he blamed the Titans, believing their interference had pushed his son toward ruin. This was the spark that ignited Deathstroke's war with the Teen Titans, a vendetta that would define much of his legend. To him, they were not just young heroes. They were a reflection of his own failures as a father, a reminder of the family he could not save. And so, his crusade became personal. He did not fight them for money or glory. He fought them to balance a scale that had long since shattered. But tragedy struck again when Joey, his youngest son, was caught in the crossfire of Slade's enemies. Targeted by assassins seeking revenge against Deathstroke, Joey's throat was slit, leaving him voiceless for life. This wound was not physical. Alone it was the crushing weight of guilt, the undeniable proof that Slade's choices condemned his family. And when Adeline discovered the full truth of Slade's mercenary identity, her rage was unstoppable. She raised a gun to the man she once loved and fired, intending to end him. The bullet missed his heart, but destroyed his right eye, leaving him scarred forever and cementing the cold visage of Deathstroke, the one-eyed assassin, the masked predator with a single, burning gaze. From that day on, Deathstroke became more than a mercenary. He became a legend whispered in fear. Governments hired him when wars needed to be won quietly. Crime lords summoned him when rivals needed to vanish. Superheroes hunted him, only to discover that his brilliance made him nearly untouchable. His mind was his deadliest weapon, always 10 steps ahead of his enemies, always calculating, always prepared. He was a tactician who could dismantle an army before the first shot was fired. A warrior who could battle gods and walk away alive. And yet, the paradox of Deathstroke remained. Beneath the ruthless killer was still a man chasing control, trying to wrestle with the chaos that had consumed his life. His war with the Titans was not just vengeance but obsession. His fractured relationship with his surviving children haunted him, and though he would never admit it, the ghost of the soldier he once was lingered deep within. Buried under layers of armor, scars, and blood, Deathstroke had become something larger than Slade Wilson ever dreamed. He was the living embodiment of consequence, a man who turned pain into power, who transformed failure into fear, and who used his broken humanity as fuel for his endless war. The mercenary, the assassin, the father, the monstrel were one. And in the darkness of his journey, one truth became clear. Deathstroke was not just a man shaped by violence. He was violence itself, sharpened to perfection, unleashed upon a world unprepared for the predator stalking its shadows. The world had already learned to whisper his name, Deathstroke, to governments. He was a phantom soldier that no army could stop. To criminals, he was both a rival and an executioner. And to heroes, he was the relentless storm always waiting at the edge of their victories. But behind the mask, Slade Wilson was drowning in the very chaos he had mastered. The mercenary who seemed untouchable was, in truth, chained to his own past, and every shadow of his life only made him sharper, deadlier, more dangerous. After years of contracts, Slade had accumulated more than wealth. He had earned a reputation that stretched across continents. He was no longer just a soldier of fortune. He had become the standard by which all assassins measured themselves. Every government wanted him. Every villain either feared him or sought his partnership. But that fame came with a price. Slade was no longer a man who could blend into the crowd. He was a figure, a myth, and myths are always hunted. His private war against the world was mirrored by a more painful, intimate conflict. His family remained the one battlefield he could never conquer. His son Grant, driven by rage and the desire to live up to his father's impossible image, had followed his path, and it destroyed him. Grant's tragic death was a wound Slade could not heal, a scar that cut deeper than any blade. It became the silent reminder that his double life had a cost higher than any bounty. His daughter Rose would also fall into his world of violence, caught between hatred and a desperate need for her father's approval. And Slade, for all his cunning, for all his brilliance as a tactician, could never truly find the strategy to repair the lives he shattered. Life became a balancing act between the man he once was and the weapon he had become. The mask was not a disguise, it was his true face now. Contracts brought him against enemies, both mortal and superhuman. He fought the Teen Titans again and again, his battles with them becoming legendary wars between youth and experience, hope and cold pragmatism to them. He was not merely a mercenary, but a force of nature, the predator that turned their idealism into fire and ash. Slade's conflict with Dick Grayson, the first Robin, grew into a rivalry etched into legend. For every triumph of the Titans, Deathstroke lurked nearby, ready to strike, to remind them that victory was never permanent. But it wasn't only heroes who felt his wrath. Slade's reputation made him a target for the criminal underworld, as well. Villains who thought themselves untouchable learned quickly that Deathstroke played by no rules but his own. He could infiltrate the most secure facilities, dismantle armies, and turn alliances into blood. He was a tactician unmatched, his mind as sharp as his blades. Every move he made on the battlefield was a calculated step in a game of chess where he was always 10 moves ahead. And yet, for all his precision, his soul remained fractured. The ghost of the man who once loved his family haunting every mission as his name echoed in the halls of both power and crime. Slade began to transcend the role of mercenary. He was no longer just a hired gun, he was a symbol. To some, he represented the corruption of war, a man who turned violence into profit. To others, he was the embodiment of fear, the reminder that even the strongest could bleed. And to himself, he was a paradox, both father and executioner, protector and destroyer, human and weapon. But there was one truth that no one could deny. When Deathstroke stepped onto the battlefield, he owned it, with enhanced reflexes, unbreakable will, and a mastery of every weapon known to man. He was more than a soldier, he was war itself. And wherever war walked, death followed close behind. As the world spiraled deeper into chaos, Slade Wilson's shadow stretched farther, touching every corner where power and violence intertwined. His story was no longer just about survival or profit. It was about legacy, about a man who became both nightmare and myth. And yet, for all the blood on his hands, the deepest wounds he carried were carved, not by his enemies, but by the faces of those he once loved. Deathstroke was unstoppable. But even he could not escape the truth. The greatest battles are not fought on the battlefield, they are fought within. And the war inside Slade Wilson had only just begun. The story of Slade Wilson reaches its darkest crescendo in the shadow between man and myth, between assassin and avenger. By this point, Deathstroke had carved his legend across the world through blood, steel, and fire. Governments had failed to control him, armies had failed to stop him, and even the most gifted heroes had struggled to match him. He had become more than a man. He had become an inevitability. Too many, his mask symbolized not just death, but destiny itself. For Slade, however, destiny had always been a chain, and his entire life had been a war to break free of it. Yet with every mission, every betrayal, every tragedy, that chain only tightened. The mercenary had lived long enough to see the lines blur. Once, he could distinguish between right and wrong, between contract and conscience. But after decades of violence, what remained was only the mission. Deathstroke was a man haunted by the lives he took and the lives he failed to save. His family, the closest thing he had to redemption, remained fractured, torn apart by the very power that made him who he was. His son Jericho, wounded by his father's failures. His daughter Rose, struggling to understand whether she inherited strength or curse. Slade had given them his blood, but it was a poisoned gift, one that carried the weight of his sins. To them, Deathstroke was not just a father. He was a shadow that could never leave their lives, no matter how far they tried to run. And yet, in his own twisted way, Slade loved them. That was his torment. He had been forged into the ultimate weapon, but at the cost of his humanity. Every time he tried to reclaim it, the world demanded that he return to the battlefield. Even when he tried to disappear, new wars would call him back. Super soldier, assassin, general, legend. The roles shifted, but the truth remained. There was no escape. Deathstroke was bound to violence, not by choice, but by nature. And though he wore the mask of the Terminator, beneath it was still a man bleeding. Still a man who longed for peace yet destroyed it everywhere he went. As the years passed, Death's reputation grew into something larger than life. He was whispered about in criminal underworlds, cursed in war rooms, and studied in the files of heroes who sought to understand how to stop him. To the Teen Titans, he was their greatest enemy, the specter who had stalked them since their earliest days, testing them, breaking them, shaping them. To Batman, he was the dark reflection of what happens when discipline and strategy are corrupted by greed and vengeance. To the Justice League, he was a variable too dangerous to ignore, a single man capable of changing the outcome of wars. He was not powered by magic, or gods, or alien birthrights. He was powered by will, and that made him unpredictable. That made him unstoppable. But even legends bleed. Even Deathstroke could fall. Time and again, he was brought to the edge of death, betrayed by allies, beaten by foes, left broken and scarred. Yet every time, he rose. Every time, he returned. For Deathstroke's survival was not a gift, it was a curse. He had been given enhanced healing, strength, and intellect, but these gifts ensured that his suffering would never truly end. He could not escape himself. He could not die as easily as other men. And so, his story stretched on like a wound that never healed. The world would always know his name, because Deathstroke would always rise again. The question that haunted him most was not whether he was the greatest assassin in history, but whether he was truly in control of his own fate. Was he a man making choices, or was he simply a weapon built to destroy until there was nothing left? Slade Wilson was not a villain in his own eyes. He was a soldier. He was a survivor. But history would never remember him that way. History would remember the mask, the blade, the gun, and the trail of blood left behind. It would remember Deathstroke. And so the myth endures. In the quiet spaces of the night, soldiers whisper of the one-eyed mercenary who could take on an army alone. Criminals tell tales of the man who cannot be bought, only bargained with. Heroes steel themselves for the day when the Terminator will once again appear, stepping from the shadows, sword in hand, ready to test their resolve. Deathstroke does not rest, for war never rests. He is the embodiment of conflict itself, the eternal reminder that no matter how strong you are, there is always someone stronger. No matter how fast you are, there is always someone faster. And no matter how good you think you are, Deathstroke will always be there, watching, calculating, waiting. Slade Wilson's story is not one of redemption, nor of simple villainy. It is the story of a man trapped between duty and destruction, between family and fury, between the soldier he was and the legend he became. He is a man who cannot escape his own shadow, and as long as there are wars to fight, contracts to fulfill, and enemies to outwit, Deathstroke will remain. The mask will never fall, the blade will never dull, the war will never end. For Deathstroke is not merely a man, he is the Terminator, and the Terminator is forever.